while in custody, Lopez claimed to have raped and killed more than 300 girls from Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru.
The police are against the people. They saved him.
Here in this country, only the rich people have access to the police, to justice.
If somebody killed one person, or killed 100, or killed 1,000, he will receive the same sentence.
He does not consciously know right from wrong, and he does not feel guilty or remorseful for what he does.
Between 1969 and 1980, Pedro Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes, killed and molested over 300 child victims in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. And despite facing justice, he has been free since 1998, and his whereabouts are unknown. Pedro Alonzo Lopez was born in Tolmia, Colombia, in October 8, 1948, during the height of the country's La Violencia period. This was in fact the last place on earth anyone would have wanted to be born. The country was ruled by riots and unthinkable acts of violence. The problem began in 1948 when a popular liberal politician was assassinated and a civil war broke loose. The war would continue for the next 10 years and take over 200,000 lives before it was over. The son of a penniless prostitute, Pedro was the seventh of 13 children. His mother was an overbearing woman who dominated her children, and his father was murdered about 6 months before he was born.
The absence of a father for Pedro made him look for one in other people.
Lopez never knew his own father, Medardo Reyes. Reyes was a member of Colombia's Conservative Party who was caught in the crossfire of La Violencia, Colombia's civil war. He was shot and killed on April 9, 1948. At the time, Lopez's mother was 3 months pregnant with Pedro.
I thought I was going to lose him from the shock. I could feel him inside me, but he was of strong blood.
6 months later, on October 8, 1948, Pedro Lopez was born in the Colombian town of Santa Isabel. When he was about 5 years old, he and his family moved to Espinal. According to his mother, Lopez was a polite child who dreamed of being a teacher.
He liked to help the other children, and with his notebook, he helped them practice their vowels so they would learn. He said, "Mom, isn't it true that I'm good at teaching the children? One day I'm going to be a teacher." I said, "Yes, son. Please keep teaching them. What else can a mother say?"
But Lopez and his mother have very different accounts of what his childhood was like. She claims that even though they were poor, she was a loving mother. In a recorded interview, Lopez claimed she was abusive.
That woman was violent. It is my understanding that this woman is seeking the head, because that was not the proper way to punish your children. She would punish me with such violence.
As a little boy, he witnessed his mother commit sexual acts with men, and they hit her. In his mind, he began to believe that he had to defend what had happened to his mother and defend himself because his mother was very rough on him and would beat him.
However, his home life was better than being out on the street, where human rights violations were committed on a regular basis by the guerrillas, paramilitaries, and members of the National Armed Forces. The country's crime rate was 50 times higher than all other countries in the world. In 1957, at the age of 8, Pedro's mother caught him molesting his young sister and threw him to the streets and ordered him to never return home again. That's when an older man picked him off the streets and offered him food and a place to stay. But instead of being taken to a home with food and bedding, the man took Pedro to an abandoned building where he sodomized him numerous times before tossing him out again onto the streets.
At age 8, Pedro Lopez ran away from home. His mother believed he was kidnapped by a neighbor.
That night I cried and cried. I looked all over for him and I couldn't find him. Then I went to a man who is a fortune teller in Flanders, and he said that Pedro went in a car with a man from Cali. I borrowed money to go, and I cried and cried. They killed his father, and now my son was stolen.
Pedro became terrified of strangers. He slept in alleyways and deserted buildings and would only go out at night in search for food from trash cans and local dumps. It was almost a year before Pedro finally built up the courage to travel and eventually ended up in the capital, Bogota.
In fact, Pedro was headed to Bogota on his own. A mere child, he would have to make his home on the vicious streets of Colombia's capital city. It was here that he learned to survive on violence and hatred. It was on these mean streets that a serial killer was born. In 1956, 8-year-old Pedro Lopez was a runaway trying to survive on the streets of Bogota, Colombia. He was one of thousands of homeless children called gamines who made up the lowest rung of city life.
Most of these kids left their houses because they're abused, and the only place they can end up are the streets because they don't have any other option.
Lopez was now a part of the city's underbelly. He dug through garbage to eat and clothe himself. He began smoking a popular street drug called bazuco, a highly dangerous, impure form of cocaine. For protection, he joined a gang of other gamines.
They make very, very strong bonds between themselves. They stick together for long periods of time. They help each other, they protect each other. They have to defend themselves. They have to learn how to survive all together.
Lopez and his gang fought with knives and belts against other gamines for sleeping spots. Violence became a normal part of Lopez's life.
They learn so many things. They have to learn how to survive. And if you're going to survive on the streets, you have to steal. And if you're going to survive with other kids that are delinquents, you have to learn how to defend yourself, how to fight.
Lopez says he was hardened by these experiences. It was during this time, he later claimed, that he'd been sexually victimized by a man.
Being a child, I lost my innocence. They dishonored me.
According to Lopez, a man offered him a bed and a hot meal. Lopez accepted, but instead was taken to an abandoned building and raped.
I hated it. When I see a certain person, let's say a male adult, that does not respect a young boy, well, I see to it to fix that person.
Lopez said he couldn't go to the police. Rarely did they do anything about the plight of a gamine. After the incident, he said he went outside only at night.
After a few days of begging for food and scavenging dumpsters, a resident American couple approached him. The elder couple was distressed by 10-year-old Pedro's skeletal appearance and was heartbroken watching him beg for food, and provided him with a warm meal and asked him to come live with them. Pedro accepted their offer and went home with the couple. He was provided a room and eventually enrolled in a day school for orphans. But his luck wouldn't last, as in 1963, at the age of 11, a male teacher sexually molested him at his day school. All of Pedro's previous fears were reborn, and following the incident, he stole money from an office in the school and ran away from home.
Another time, when Lopez was 10, he said he was approached by an elderly American couple living in Bogota. He said they offered him a home because the sight of him begging on the street broke their hearts. According to Lopez, the couple enrolled him in a school for orphans. For a couple of years, he led a stable life, but his good fortune did not last. When he was 12 years old, a male teacher sexually molested him at his school. Lopez stole money from the school's office and ran away from the couple who had taken him in. He returned to the only thing he knew, Bogota's violent streets.
Pedro returned to the streets of Colombia. The country's civil war was nearly over. The government was reorganized, and factories which had been built during the Depression were slowly beginning to reopen. Nonetheless, Pedro had never been skilled in any trades and held only a minimal education. He spent the next 6 years of his life begging for food and committing petty thefts in order to survive. By his mid-teens, Pedro began stealing cars to support himself. He had little to lose, and local chop shops paid him well for his service. However, in 1969, 18-year-old Pedro was arrested by authorities for car theft and sentenced to serve 7 years in prison. He served just 2 days behind bars before being brutally gang-raped by 4 older inmates. Following this, he fashioned a crude knife from prison utensils and spent the following 2 weeks getting his revenge by individually murdering each of the 4 men that had raped him. Authorities deemed the murder self-defense and simply added an additional 2 years to Pedro's initial sentence for the car theft.
Lopez lived on the streets of Bogota for 13 years. In 1969, at age 21, he was arrested for stealing a car. After only 2 days behind bars, he was brutally raped by 2 older inmates. In retaliation, Lopez fashioned a crude knife out of a prison utensil and murdered his rapists.
When I was locked up in Colombia, I was taught how to defend myself. I don't deny that in Cárcel Modelo, I killed 2 in there, but the warden said, "Don't worry."
Authorities deemed the murders self-defense. No extra prison time was added to Lopez's sentence. But these murders were the beginning of a new chapter in Lopez's violent life.
Due to the mental abuse he endured at the hand of his mother during his early years, he had grown fearful of women and fulfilled his desires through pornographic books and magazines. In Pedro's mind, his mother was to blame for all of his life's suffering and his hatred of women. Upon his release from prison in 1978, Pedro traveled throughout Peru. It was during this time he later claimed to have begun stalking and killing at least 100 young girls between the ages of 9 and 12 from homeless children and various Indian tribes throughout the region, especially those in the more remote areas. He offered the young children gifts if they came along with him, specifically targeting the ones with a certain look of innocence.
In 1971, 23-year-old Pedro Alonzo Lopez was released after serving 2 years for car theft. He had endured an abusive home, the violent streets of Colombia, and a prison rape. Now, he wanted revenge. He began by searching for easy targets in towns in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru.
Gente de raza indígena y humilde.
They were poor, indigenous people, street vendors. These were the types of little girls that he chose. The poorest kids who have lesser education. He never chose white people.
Gente de raza blanca.
Lopez would pose as a salesman and approach girls between 8 and 12 years old.
He would appeal to them and he would tell them, I'm lost, could you help me find the way to the bus? Could you help me find the way out of the town?
Lopez relied on his charm to draw the girls away. He never physically kidnapped any of his victims.
He would show himself like helpless, so the children would trust him a little bit more. After that, he would take them to a place where if the children would scream, they wouldn't be heard.
First, he would sexually assault them.
He slept all night with her and then raped her again in the morning and then killed her. He would spend a long time with them.
Incredibly, he would later claim that he was helping his victims.
He said he strangled them so they would go to heaven, so that they wouldn't suffer in this world.
In this way, Lopez murdered dozens of girls, and yet his crimes received little attention, and he killed again and again.
After a cooling off period, he would look for his next victim and do it over and over again to satisfy his urges and his fantasies.
While it is impossible to verify these claims, it is known that he was captured by a group from a certain tribe in northern Peru while attempting to kidnap a 9-year-old girl. The tribe beat, stripped, and tortured Pedro for hours before deciding to bury him alive. However, an American missionary intervened and convinced his captors that murder was ungodly and that they should turn Pedro over to the proper authorities. The tribe agreed and turned Pedro over to the police. Local authorities never took Pedro Lopez into custody. Instead, he was deported to Ecuador. Indians in Peru had me tied up and buried in sand to my neck. When they found what I had been doing to their daughters, Pedro recalled of her near-death experience. They had placed syrup on on me and were going to let me be eaten by ants, but an American missionary lady came by in her jeep and promised them she would turn me over to the police. Following his deportation to Ecuador, Pedro began traveling around the region, including frequent stops in Colombia. Authorities soon began to notice an increase in missing persons cases involving young girls.
Ecuador, 1980. The small mountain town of Ambato. Dozens of girls between the ages of 8 and 12 have vanished.
The whole province, even the whole country, saw that there were so many little girls disappearing, and nobody really knew what was happening.
Their parents were desperate for answers.
I told her to go sell some things, to buy a bus ticket home and come back. And she didn't come back.
We thought maybe somebody had kidnapped her for a ransom, or that somebody took her to another country. We thought they had taken her because she was very pretty, very pretty.
In April 1979, he made his way to Ambato, Ecuador, looking for more victims. He met 11-year-old Hortensia Garces Lozada while she was selling newspapers.
My mom was pregnant at the time, and when she sold newspapers, she saved money to be able to provide for my brother.
On May 5th, 1979, Lopez asked Hortensia to be his guide in the city and gave her 100 sucres, about $10 US. He led her to the outskirts of town underneath a bridge, and then he raped her, beat her, and strangled her. He threw her body into a ditch and covered it with the same newspapers she'd been selling. When Hortensia didn't come home, her father Leonidas searched for her.
She was out there somewhere, but I didn't find her. I couldn't find her.
However, they quickly concluded that they were due to the growing South American sex slave rings and human trafficking.
At first, local police did little. They assumed the girls were just runaways.
Unfortunately, the police did not take the disappearances of the little girls seriously. The police issued a release saying that the disappearances of the girls was because they had failed their school year.
The families did what they could to find their daughters.
The last girl, Ivanova Garzon, her mother put ads in newspapers, put ads on street lamps that said she'd give a reward of 20,000 sucres if someone gave some news about the little girl, but nothing.
However, in April of 1980, a flood near Ambato, Ecuador, unearthed the remains of 4 missing children. While it was difficult for them to determine the causes of death, they concluded that the girls had obviously were murdered since someone had hidden their bodies.
And then the bodies of some of the girls started showing up. They had been raped and strangled. Then, more young girls disappeared. Now the families demanded answers. But the police had no leads and no suspects.
We didn't have any evidence to begin to identify a suspect. We didn't have anyone who could provide some type of identification or give us a sketch.
Just days after, a local resident, Carvina Poveda, was shopping at a local marketplace with her 12-year-old daughter Mary when an unknown man attempted to abduct the young girl. Carvina cried out for help as the man tried to flee the market with her daughter in his arms. Local merchants quickly came to her aid, chased the man down before he could make his escape, and held him down as the authorities were summoned.
Sunday, March 9th, 1980, a typical morning in Ambato. The plaza buzzed with activity. Fruit and vegetable vendors were setting up their stalls. Hot food stands were already cooking. No one paid any attention to a stranger peddling his wares. He was selling chains, padlocks, and other trinkets. The man walked the plaza most of the day. Then he approached a vendor named Carlina Ramon.
It was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This man asks me to sell him food. He began looking into my pots to see what I had, and then he kept looking at my daughter as if to try to get her attention.
Carlina's daughter Alicia was 11 years old at the time.
He would look at me funny, strangely, and gesture for me to come over. So I went to my mother and told her, "You know what, Mommy? This man keeps looking at me ugly and keeps calling me to come to him."
Carlina spotted the man leaving the plaza. She'd heard about the missing girls of Ecuador and immediately was suspicious. She recruited other vendors to help catch him. Just outside the plaza, Carlina and her friends overtook the man and dragged him back. Carlina accused him of kidnapping and killing the little girls.
He says, "No, ma'am. I'm a poor worker. I'm a humble man. I'm not a thief. I'm not anything. I have a clean heart."
The townspeople weren't convinced. They held the man until police came to take him in for questioning.
Pedro was rambling incoherently when police arrived as they traveled back to headquarters with their suspect. Their initial conclusion was that they had a madman in custody. Pedro refused to cooperate with authorities and remained silent throughout their lines of questioning. Investigators soon realized that they would have to employ a different strategy in order to get him to talk. Their plan was to dress up a local priest in prison outfit and place him in a cell with Pedro. The priest would then win Pedro's confidence and get him to discuss his crimes, and by the next day he had revealed such repulsive acts of violence that the priest couldn't handle more and asked to be taken out of the cell. Following a brief interview with the priest, investigators confronted Pedro with their newly acquired evidence, and he finally broke down. Pedro confessed to investigators he had murdered at least 100 girls in Ecuador, 100 in Colombia, and many more than 100 in Peru, meaning he had up to 350 victims. "I like the girls in Ecuador," he told them. "They are more gentle and trusting, more innocent. They are not as suspicious of strangers as Colombian girls." In the course of his confession, Pedro blamed his crimes on his hard life and lonely adolescence. "I lost my innocence at age 8. He explained, "So I decided to do the same to as many girls as I could." When asked how he was able to pull off his self-professed crimes, Pedro informed them he oftentimes trolled village markets for selected targets. With a certain look of innocence, he always searched for his victims in full daylight because he did not want darkness to hide their pain of death from him. When asked what he meant by this, Pedro explained that he would first rape his victims and then strangle them as he stared into their eyes. He claimed to feel deep pleasure and sexual excitement watching their life fade before him. He went on to state that the horror would even continue after their death. He would oftentimes act out gruesome tea parties with the bodies of the dead little girls, propping them and talking to them. Police were initially skeptical of Pedro's confessions, and liaison with Peru and Colombia were unable to substantiate them. As Pedro realized that investigators doubted the truthfulness of his claims, he offered to lead them to several burial spots throughout the country. With little else they could do, investigators agreed and put the plan into action. Pedro led them to a secluded area near Ambato, where they discovered the remains of 53 girls aged 8 to 12. Throughout the day, Pedro led them to 28 other sites. However, no other bodies were discovered. Some of the investigators felt that animals had most likely scattered the remains, and floods had washed what little was left away.
Police learned his name was Pedro Alonzo Lopez, a native of Colombia. Interrogators tried strong-arming Lopez to gain more information.
They could not apply force or intimidation in the investigation. It didn't work. The man refused to talk.
But then, after a few hours in detention, Lopez began opening up to an officer named Pastor Cordova.
Pastor Cordova, the captain at the time, took charge of the case and began to do a very scientific and intelligent investigation by gaining his trust.
It was to him that Lopez confessed his story. He said he'd spent the last 7 years traveling between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. those 3 countries, he claimed he had raped and murdered as many as 300 young girls. The captain was stunned. It seemed impossible that one man could have carried out so much violence. If Lopez was telling the truth, he'd rank among the most prolific serial killers in history.
He seemed like an ordinary person. It was unbelievable that this man killed so many little girls.
He said the grave sites were scattered all over the country and offered to lead police to each one.
He would take the girls to the desolate areas, fulfill his sexual appetite, and then he would strangle them and leave them covered in newspapers or branches.
His confession set off a heartbreaking 6-week search for the bodies of his victims.
Something that struck me about Pedro Alonzo was how cold he acted when he was identifying the grave sites. It was as if what he'd done was normal.
Lopez would lead police across 11 Ecuadorian provinces, a journey that would reveal the truth behind this seemingly insignificant man.
Nobody realized it was the criminal who was leading police to the graves. They dressed him up as a policeman and nobody recognized him.
Their first stop was on the outskirts of Ambato.
He told police he had caught a girl who sold newspapers and that he killed her and that she was buried under the Ficoa Bridge.
We found a complete skeleton with clothes on it. Of course, the body was decomposed. And when we look at it, we found the bones were corroded. I remember, a leg and a hand.
It was the corpse of Hortensia Garces Losada. Lopez had killed her 10 months before. At first, police had difficulty identifying the body, but Hortensia's family had arrived and seen something they recognized.
We were beginning to take out the body, and the family members recognized the clothes.
And then we knew that that was our sister. We went and found her remains. That's all, just bones.
Oh, I was suffering for my daughter. The tortures he did, what he did, his terror. It was terrible for a father to see the horrors that he committed when you saw her. If I had a gun, I would kill him. But there was a policeman on one side and a policeman on another side.
The father wanted to kill this criminal. He shouted, "Justice, justice." And the people began to throw rocks at us. Then police intervened.
They had to take him out disguised because people wanted to lynch him. They wanted to kill him.
The discovery of Hortensia Garces Losada was only the beginning.
As men, as police, we felt the need for revenge, but we had to hold out until the very end. It was very emotional for us, even though we were professionals. We couldn't stand what was going on, but we had to control ourselves until we got the information we needed.
Police did their best to keep Lopez talking.
One strategy we used was to give him tobacco, coffee. We invited him to eat chicken. We gave him beer, and he calmed himself completely.
Over the next 6 weeks, Lopez led investigators to gravesite after gravesite. It was a horrific tour that Lopez seemed eager to take.
He remembered everything, places, dates and times, and descriptions of the girls. Just an incredible memory.
He remembered where he had buried the bodies of the little girls. Not only in Ambato, but in the surrounding different sectors of Tungurahua.
He was satisfied that he had shown us the bodies. He didn't feel anything. No remorse, no guilt, nothing.
At a gravesite in Salcedo, Ecuador, Lopez showed off his brutal handiwork.
He grabbed the skull and placed it under his arm so we could take a picture of him. Captain Cordova took it away from him. What he wanted was to have a trophy, and he was proudly showing what he had done.
In all, police would unearth the remains of 57 of Lopez's young victims. The case of the missing girls was solved.
Pedro was charged with 57 counts of murder. However, it was boosted to 110 as a result of his detailed confessions. The director of prison affairs, Victor Lascano, later explained, "If someone confesses to 53 you find, and hundreds more, you tend to believe what he says." Lascano also told reporters that, "I think his estimation of 300 is very low."
He willingly showed police 57 bodies, and based on his confessions, was charged with 110 counts of murder. He claimed to have committed 200 more.
I am the worst of the worst. Perhaps I took it too far because of my ignorance. The low of the low. Perhaps even a complete animal.
In addition, editions of Guinness World Record up to 2005 credited Lopez as being the most prolific serial killer. The listing was removed in newer editions after complaints it made a competition out of murder. Unfortunately, no information is available on Pedro's trial. However, in 1980, 32-year-old Pedro Lopez was ultimately convicted for the murders of 110 people and sentenced to the maximum term allowed under Ecuadorian law. That was only 16 years in Garcia Moreno prison.
On July 31st, 1981, 33-year-old Pedro Alonzo Lopez pled guilty in an Ecuadorian court to the murders of 57 girls. He was now imprisoned in the town of Ambato. He knew that it didn't matter how many girls he killed. The law did not allow for consecutive sentences.
Even if you kill 1 or 1,000, it's 16 years.
Lopez was right. His sentence amounted to 4 months for every girl he murdered.
The fact that he only got 16 years, that's not justice. A fair sentence would have been life in prison.
The authorities and the laws are terrible. They should have seen it was a special case. They didn't do it.
After 2 years in prison in Ambato, Lopez was transferred to the Garcia Moreno, a prison in Quito, Ecuador. He was kept in Pabellon D, the wing reserved for murderers and rapists. Lopez passed his days alone, smoking bazuco, scribbling in a diary, and carving coins with Jesus on one side and the devil on the other.
I have always lived in poverty, and I have ambition being powerful one day, or of great importance. I understand what I have done. There is no going back.
He served his time patiently. He would be a free man by his 50th birthday and soon be able to wander the countryside again. On August 31st, 1994, serial killer Pedro Alonzo Lopez was released from the Garcia Moreno prison after serving 14 years of a 16-year sentence. He was released 2 years early for good behavior.
Because of his conduct, they pardoned him a few years and he got out. And he got out when he was still very young, 45 years old.
The parents of the murdered girls were devastated by the length of Lopez's sentence, and many people thought someone should take the law into their own hands.
I wanted revenge. I wanted to break him into pieces because he killed my baby.
My friends gathered wood. so I could try and burn him alive.
Then he was released 2 years early, on August 31, 1994, for good behavior, and deported back to Colombia.
But the victims' families would have no chance to seek vengeance because Lopez's stay in Ecuador was short-lived. He was detained just 1 hour after he was released. The superintendent of the province had ordered him back into custody so that he could be deported to Colombia.
Usted es extranjero y si usted no tiene la documentación en regla, yo no puedo ponerle en libertad.
The next day, on September 1st, Ecuadorian immigration officials handed Lopez over to Colombian authorities at the Rumicacha International Bridge at the border of the two countries. One of the most prolific serial killers in history was home.
The high authorities, judges, never do justice for the poor person. They always do it against the poor people. Those of us who have a house, a family, we have to take care of ourselves and look out for ourselves.
Yo derogaría a las leyes del Ecuador.
I would ask those who make the laws, judges, lawmakers, to work for the humble people and the poor people. I would ask that they do justice and protect everyone so this kind of crimes never happen again.
There he was expected to face the firing squad for his crimes committed in the country, but prosecutors were unable to make a case for it. A judge instead declared that Lopez was insane and ordered that he be placed in a psychiatric hospital. But then, in 1998, the hospital unexpectedly declared him to be sane and released him with a $70 bail. Lopez was supposed to report to police each month, but he never did.
Authorities feared Lopez would continue killing people. The Colombian DAS, the country's national security department, would not allow him to roam at will. Shortly after his arrival in Colombia, DAS officials picked him up, processed him, and then handed him over to prosecutors in the Colombian state of Tolmia. There, prosecutors hoped to take advantage of the country's harsher laws and put Lopez away for good. Lopez was charged with a 2-decades-old murder case. Back in December 1979, Lopez had traveled to Espinal. Within a month, 12-year-old Flor Sanchez disappeared. Her body had been found half buried in a rural area near the city. Her mother, Alba Sanchez, identified her daughter's remains later that day at the police station.
I entered and they said, "Inspect the clothes. Maybe there's a little dress." Yes, it was my daughter.
The murder seemed to match Lopez's pattern, and Colombian authorities had more than enough evidence for a conviction.
God forgive me. They should take his life. How can you let a guy live that keeps killing like this? Why would they let him live?
Yet again, Lopez dodged harsh punishment. In late 1995, he was declared insane and condemned to the psychiatric wing of the Cárcel Modelo in Bogotá. Just 3 years later, in February of 1998, a prison psychiatrist declared Lopez sane.
It could either be that the psychiatrist really felt that he was recovered or that he faked it. I mean, he went on for 10, 12 years killing people without being caught. He was smart. He could have faked being better. He could have faked change.
A mere $50 bail freed this serial killer. He was released with 2 conditions. He had to continue to receive psychiatric treatment and report once a month to a judge.
Also, after his release, he visited his elderly mother, who said he asked for his inheritance and then, upon being informed of her poverty, sold her bed and chair to people on the street.
Lopez decided to revisit his past. He traveled to Espinal from Bogotá to see his mother Benilda for the first time in 19 years.
The day he came to visit me, he says to me, "Mother, kneel down in front of me so I can bless you." And I said, "The one who should kneel down is you. The son is the one who kneels before his mother." He got down on only one knee.
But then Lopez showed his cruel streak.
Madrecita, yo vengo a ver qué me da de herencia de...
He said, "Mother, I came to see what you would give me of my inheritance." And I said to him, "I'm so poor. How am I going to give you something? I just have a chair and a bed." He took those two things and put them on the porch, and I started crying. And he said, "Who will buy this? If not, I'll light them on fire." Then a woman bought the chair and the little bed, and then he left.
Lopez pocketed the money and disappeared. He went back into the countryside he knew so well, to the killing ground where he had found so many victims. That was the last time anyone reported seeing Pedro Alonzo Lopez. His mother believes he has managed to avoid being killed by the families of his victims.
Up until now, I haven't felt it. When someone dies, you feel a shock, and I haven't felt anything. I believe in what our Lord says. When a person dies, it's revealed to others. So there was nothing revealed to me.
Just a few years later, in 2002, the Colombian National Police and Interpol issued a new warrant for his arrest in connection with a new murder case.
Then, in October 2002, Interpol released an advisory on behalf of the Colombian authorities, stating they were looking for Lopez. They suspect he had committed another murder in Espinal.
But the last time Lopez was seen in public was in 1999, when he was renewing his citizenship card in Bogota. His whereabouts remain unknown to this day, and the Interpol warrant was deactivated in 2005.
The following video was posted by an unknown man, and it was said that the man in question was offering pencils to little girls in the village.
Shortly before his release from prison in Ecuador, in January of 1994, Pedro Lopez gave an exclusive, one-time only interview to National Examiner correspondent Ron Leitner. "I am the man of the century," Lopez bragged. "No one will ever forget me. I went after my victims by walking among markets, searching for a girl with a certain look to her face, a look of innocence and beauty. She would be a good girl, working with her mother. I followed them sometimes for 2 or 3 days, waiting for when she was left alone. I would give her a trinket, like a hand mirror, then take her to the edge of town, where I would promise a trinket for her mother. I would take her to a secret hideaway where prepared graves waited. Sometimes there were bodies of earlier victims there. I cuddled them and then raped them at the first sign of light. I would get excited. I forced the girl into sex and put my hands around her throat. When the sun rose, I would strangle her. It was only good if I could see her eyes. It would have been wasted in the dark. I had to watch them by daylight. There is a divine moment when I have my hands around a young girl's throat. I look into her eyes and see a certain light. A spark suddenly go out. The moment of death is exciting. Only those who actually kill know what I mean. When I am released, I will feel that moment again. They never screamed because they didn't expect anything would happen. They were innocent. My little friends liked to have company," he said. "I often put 3 or 4 into one hole. But after a while, I got bored because they couldn't move, so I looked for more girls."
Lopez relished the attention. He wasn't shy about discussing his crimes or philosophizing about life and death on camera.
No, pues cuando uno se muere, pues pierde uno por total, pierde uno lo que es los sentimientos, su visibilidad de los ojos para ver, y una muerte que uno ya no vuelve ni saber quién es uno, ¿no? Todo queda así en una oscuridad nula.
Lopez, it seemed, hoped to gain a twisted kind of immortality.
Esto queda en la historia, ¿sí o no? ¿Sí me van a pasar el pareón? Yo estoy muy joven para morir.
Lopez seemed proud of raping and murdering so many young girls. Throughout the interview, Lopez tried to explain his crimes. First, he claimed that he was a killer because of the sexual and physical abuse he had suffered as a child.
I, Pedro Alonzo Lopez, who supposedly eliminated a small group of insignificants and allegedly took away their innocence. But my innocence has been taken away from me.
I think that it did have something to do with the way he constructed in his head what sex or sexual relations are. If it's always forced on you, if it's always through violence, and if you receive it in your own life, why not repeat it with somebody else?
But psychologists believe Lopez's brutal crimes also satisfied another twisted desire.
Uno de los motivos por los cuales él tenía que matarlas era porque eran pobres.
One of the reasons he said he killed them was because they were poor. Maybe he found them ugly or useless and he tried to stomp out the weakness. This allows them to feel stronger, bigger.
He was always an unimportant person. He was living on the streets. He had no recognition, no social recognition whatsoever. And this was a moment for him to be big, to show the world what he was doing.
On other occasions, Lopez blamed an alternate personality called Jorge Patiño for the murders.
¿Cuántas violaciones realmente cometió Pedro Alonso? Yo no cometía, yo estoy implicado como cómplice. Claro que participé en el hecho, pero me tenía sugestionado bajo amenaza de muerte que si lo delataba, que él me mataba. Pero Jorge Patiño eres tú mismo, decía. No, padre, yo soy Pedro Alonzo López para servirle.
While in prison, Lopez underwent a psychological evaluation. It was determined that he was a sociopath, that he suffered from an antisocial personality disorder.
He does not consciously know right from wrong, and he does not feel guilty or remorseful for what he does.
He is not able of understanding other people's pain or feelings, that what he does is for his own pleasure, without any concern of the other person.
But are his statements signs of a pathology or merely of a cruel and calculating mind?
You asked me if I felt anything while asphyxiating certain persons. Well, no. It's strange, no? Someone who shoots another with a gun and the other person feels the pain of the bullet. Is the shooter going to feel the same agony or the same pain?
Lopez was very good at using his words to manipulate others.
People with personality disorders are very smart, and they use their language in a way to try to justify their actions very well. They're very skillful.